Asterisk. My neighbor told me, don't look at me that way, but the way she smiled afterward made me wonder if she wanted me to keep looking all along. I never thought much about the apartment next door until she moved in. At first, it was just little things I noticed, boxes being carried in, the sound of furniture being shuffled around late into the evening. I figured she was just another neighbor, someone I might nod to in passing but never really know. But the first time I actually saw her, something about the moment etched itself into my memory like it had been waiting for me all along. She was standing on her small balcony that morning, watering plants that hadn't yet taken root in their pots. The light was soft, filtered by drifting clouds, and it caught in her hair in a way that made me pause. She wasn't dressed up for anyone, just in a loose sweater, sleeves pushed back, her hair loosely tied. But the simplicity of it suited her. She looked comfortable in her own skin, graceful in a way that didn't need attention. I was heading out with a book in my hand, but I slowed when I heard her voice, quiet, almost to herself, humming a tune as she gently brushed soil from her fingers. For a moment, I thought she hadn't noticed me. Then she looked up, and our eyes met. It was only a second. 2, maybe. But in that second, I caught something that made me forget to breathe. Her smile flickered, quick and polite, before disappearing as if she had reminded herself not to linger too long. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and turned back to her plants, as though the simple task of pouring water over soil was suddenly the only thing that mattered. I kept walking, not wanting to stare. But I couldn't help noticing the little details, the faint trace of perfume carried by the morning breeze, subtle but distinct, blending with the earthy smell of wet soil. The sound of water spilling gently from the can. Even the curve of her hand as she tilted it, careful and steady. There was something quietly captivating about the way she moved, measured, intentional, like someone who had lived long enough to savor the small things. She didn't radiate the kind of beauty that demands a room's attention. Hers was the kind that draws you in slowly, before you even realize you've been caught. As I walked down the steps, I tried to shrug it off. She was just my neighbor. Probably in her early 40s, maybe mid. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had already lived through a dozen chapters one hadn't yet reached. And me, I was just the guy next door, too young to pretend I belonged in her orbit. Still, something about her lingered with me that day. Not just the image of her on the balcony, hair lit by the morning sun, but the way her brief smile had felt, fragile. As though beneath the quiet confidence, there was something else, something she wasn't ready to let anyone see. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to see it. The second time I saw her, it wasn't by chance. It was the kind of encounter that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Ordinary, yet it lingers afterward, like a song stuck in your head. I had left my window open the night before, the way I often do when I'm playing guitar. It wasn't anything serious. I'm not a musician, not really. Just chords I like to strum when the world feels too quiet. That morning, as I stepped out onto the shared landing between our apartments, I found her standing there, balancing a set of grocery bags against her hip. "You play late," she said, her voice calm but carrying the faintest edge of amusement. "Some of us neighbors are learning your playlist by heart." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. She wasn't complaining exactly. Her tone was too light for that, as though she was trying to scold me without quite meaning it. I smiled, rubbing the back of my neck. "Sorry about that. Guess I lose track of time sometimes." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but close enough to stir something in me. "It's fine," she said, shifting the grocery bag against her side. "Better than the usual noise people make around here." I offered to help, stepping closer to take the heavier bag from her. She hesitated for the briefest second before letting me, and our hands brushed in the exchange. Her fingers were cool, soft, the touch fleeting but sharper than it should have been. She noticed it too. I could see the flicker in her eyes as she looked up at me. That's when I realized her eyes weren't just brown. They held a softness, warm and searching, the kind that made it impossible to look away. She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and then, almost abruptly, turned toward her door. "You read a lot, don't you?" she asked, nodding toward the book sticking out of my jacket pocket. I glanced down, surprised she'd noticed. Yeah. Helps me think less sometimes. Her hand paused on the doorknob. Or more. She murmured, almost like she was speaking to herself. Then she gave a small, dismissive shake of her head, as if brushing away a thought she didn't want to follow. The hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of a neighbor's air conditioner. The late afternoon light poured through the narrow window, falling across her face in a way that softened the sharper lines. She looked younger in that moment, almost vulnerable, though she carried herself with the same poise as before. I wanted to say something else, something that would make her stay in the moment with me a little longer. But before I could, she offered me a polite nod. Thanks for the help. And maybe keep the window cracked just a little less at midnight. Her tone was light again, teasing, but I caught the corner of her mouth twitching upward as she closed the door. And just like that, she was gone, leaving me in the hallway with her perfume still hanging faintly in the air, and the thought that maybe, just maybe, she didn't mind hearing my music after all. It was a Saturday evening when our paths crossed again, the kind of evening where the air feels heavy but calm, carrying the faint scent of rain that hasn't yet fallen. I was heading up the stairs with a couple of grocery bags when I saw her struggling with a box just outside her apartment door. The box wasn't massive, but the way she shifted her weight told me it was heavier than it looked. She paused to push her hair back, a faint crease forming on her brow. Need a hand? I asked, setting my own bags down. She gave me a look that was half pride, half relief. I was determined to do it myself, she said softly, her breath just a little uneven. But I suppose I could let you rescue me this once. I smiled and stepped closer, reaching for the box. As our hands met over the cardboard, something small but unmistakable happened. Her fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't accidental either. For a moment neither of us pulled back. Her skin was cool, smooth, and the contact made the air around us feel heavier, charged in a way I couldn't explain. That's when she said it. Quiet, almost playful, but with an edge I didn't miss. Don't look at me that way. Her words caught me off guard, though the slight curve of her lips told me she wasn't angry. Teasing, maybe? Guarding herself, definitely. I tilted my head, feigning confusion. What way? She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as though to end the subject. That way, she repeated, more gently this time. She pulled her hand back and turned toward her door, leaving me to carry the box inside. Inside her apartment, the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and something floral, maybe a candle burning nearby. I set the box down where she pointed, trying not to glance too long at the details that made her space feel so much like her. Books stacked neatly by the arm of the sofa, a throw blanket folded but not perfectly straight, framed photos turned just slightly toward the light. When I stood, she was watching me, arms loosely crossed, lips pressed into a line that couldn't decide between amusement and restraint. I appreciate the help, she said softly. Then, almost as an afterthought, but you make it very hard to keep my guard up when you look at me like that. The honesty in her voice left me momentarily still. She had caught me, caught the way my eyes lingered, the way I was drawn to her even when I tried not to be. I wanted to answer, to say something clever or reassuring. But before I could, she walked past me, brushing lightly against my arm as she reached for the door. The faintest trace of her perfume lingered in the air between us, leaving me with the memory of her words, echoing quietly in my mind. Don't look at me that way. And yet I knew I already was. It happened on a night when the weather turned unexpectedly. Clouds had rolled in heavy and low, and by evening the sky opened, releasing a rain so steady it blurred the city into a watercolor wash of lights. I'd been sitting near my window, guitar idle in my lap, when the power flickered once, then went out completely. For a while, I just sat in the dark, listening to the rain pound against the glass and the occasional rumble of thunder. The building was hushed except for the storm, until a soft knock sounded at my door. When I opened it, she was standing there with a small flashlight in her hand. Its glow painted her face in soft amber, shadows flickering gently across her features. Her hair was damp from the dash across the landing, strands clinging to her sweater. "Do you have any candles?" she asked, her voice low, carrying that mix of composure and hesitation I was beginning to recognize as hers. "I think so," I said, stepping aside. "Come in, I'll look." She hesitated for a beat, then crossed the threshold. The scent of rain clung to her, fresh and sharp, mixing with the faint trace of her perfume. I found a couple of candles in the cupboard and lit them. Their glow filled the room with a muted warmth, the kind of light that makes everything feel closer, softer. She took a seat by the window, setting her flashlight down. For a while neither of us spoke. The rain was enough, steady, rhythmic, like a song that needed no accompaniment. Finally, she broke the silence. "Nights like these used to scare me," she admitted, her voice softer than the storm. "The dark, the thunder, it all felt too big. Now it just feels empty." I turned toward her, surprised by the openness in her words. She was staring out the window, watching the water run down the glass, her profile caught in candlelight. "Empty how?" I asked gently. Her shoulders lifted in a faint shrug. "The house feels quieter when there's no one waiting for you. The silence is louder somehow." There was something in her tone, an ache she hadn't meant to reveal, maybe. I didn't press, but I listened. Really listened. And I think she felt that, because her posture softened, and for the first time she turned fully toward me, her expression bare in a way I hadn't seen before. "You're young," she said, almost wistful. "You probably can't imagine that kind of quiet." I shook my head. "I can imagine more than you think." For a moment, the storm outside filled the silence between us again. The candle flickered, throwing light across her face, and I could see the faintest tug at the corner of her lips, not quite a smile, but close. Something shifted then. The space between us didn't feel like neighbor and neighbor anymore. It felt like two people carrying different weights, sharing the same shelter for a moment in time. And though the rain kept falling, the quiet didn't feel so empty anymore. The storm had passed by the next evening, leaving the air cool and fresh, the kind that carries the faint sweetness of wet earth and blooming plants. I was unlocking my door when hers opened, and she stepped out, holding a small bag of trash. "Back to normal, huh?" I said, giving a nod toward the clear sky. She glanced at me, and there was the faintest sparkle in her eyes. "Normal is a matter of perspective," she replied. Then, tilting her head, she added, "Though I suppose for you, normal means keeping everyone awake with late-night concerts." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Still holding that against me?" Her lips curved, not quite a smile but more than a smirk. "Of course. I need something to tease you about." She brushed past me to head down the hall, and in doing so, her hand grazed my sleeve. Light, almost careless, but it left behind a warmth I couldn't shake. She didn't pull back quickly either. Instead, she let it linger just long enough to make me wonder if it was truly accidental. "You stare too much, you know," she said suddenly, her tone light, almost musical. I raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" "Yes." She gave me a sidelong glance, her eyes bright with mischief. "And don't even try to deny it. You look at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle you'll never figure out." Her words should have embarrassed me. Maybe they did a little. But the way she said them, playful, teasing, carried no real edge. If anything, it felt like she was daring me to keep looking. "And what if I'm not trying to solve anything?" I asked. She laughed softly, the sound low and warm, curling through the air like smoke. "Then you're even more dangerous." For a moment, silence settled between us. She leaned casually against the wall, as if to prove she was unaffected, but her body betrayed her, shoulders angled toward me, her gaze lingering when she thought I wasn't noticing. I thought back to the night of the storm, to the way her voice had softened when she spoke of emptiness, the vulnerability she had let slip. Now, she was covering it again with this teasing wall, this playful mask. But walls don't always push people away. Sometimes they invite you closer, daring you to see what's behind them. She turned finally, walking toward her door. Just before stepping inside, she looked over her shoulder, her eyes catching mine once more. "Careful," she said, her tone laced with mock sternness. "Keep looking at me that way, and I might start to believe you mean it." Then she closed the door, leaving me in the quiet hallway with my pulse still unsteady and the ghost of her touch warm on my sleeve. Her words were meant as a joke, I knew. But the way she had looked at me, it didn't feel like a joke at all. It was one of those evenings when the world feels like it's slowing down. The sun had just dipped beneath the horizon, leaving behind streaks of amber and violet across the sky. I was locking my bike near the front steps when I saw her walking up the path, arms full of paper bags from the corner store. "Let me help," I called, stepping forward. She sighed in mock protest but didn't argue, handing me one of the bags. Our fingers touched again, brief but deliberate this time, and she let her hand linger half a beat longer than necessary. We walked side by side up the narrow path toward the building. The sound of our footsteps blended with the soft hum of crickets in the distance. She glanced at me once, then again, as if weighing whether or not to say what was sitting on her tongue. "You know," she began, her voice softer than usual, "you have this way of making things feel different." I tilted my head. "Different how?" Her lips pressed together, as if she regretted speaking so openly. She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the steps. "Like the air is lighter when you're around. Like I forget for a moment that people are watching, or that I'm supposed to keep myself guarded." Her voice trailed off, the last word almost swallowed by the night. She shifted the bag in her arms, as if that motion might cover what she just revealed. I didn't rush to answer. I just let her words settle in the quiet between us. The truth was, I'd felt it too, that same shift whenever she was near, that same lightness. But I also knew how fragile that admission felt coming from her, how much courage it must have taken. When we reached the landing, she stopped in front of her door, her shoulders angled toward me though her eyes stayed fixed on the ground. The porch light above us flickered weakly, casting a dim glow that made everything softer, less defined. "You shouldn't read too much into it," she said finally, her tone retreating back into carefulness. I don't usually let people close. And with you." She paused, inhaling deeply, then shook her head. "It feels different. That's all." For a moment, I wanted to close the space between us, to tell her that I understood, that I felt the same pull. But I didn't. Not yet. Something in her eyes told me she wasn't ready to hear it spoken out loud. Instead, I just nodded. "Different isn't always bad." She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine, as if trying to decide whether I really believed what I'd said. For a heartbeat, either of us moved. Her shoulder brushed lightly against my arm, and though it was the smallest touch, it sent warmth rushing through me. Finally, she broke the gaze, fumbling for her keys. "Good night," she whispered, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. And as her door closed, I stood there in the quiet night, heart still racing, knowing that different was the one thing neither of us could ignore anymore. It was late on a Friday evening when I heard the knock. Soft, almost hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if she wanted me to answer. I set down the book I'd been reading and opened the door. She was standing there in casual clothes, a loose blouse, her hair falling more freely than I'd ever seen it. In her hand she held a mug. "Ran out of sugar," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Thought you might have some." I smiled, stepping aside. "Come in. I'll check." She hesitated just long enough for me to notice, then slipped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air in my apartment felt different, warmer, charged in that familiar, unspoken way. While I rummaged in the kitchen, I could feel her presence behind me, hear the faint sound of her fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic mug she held. When I turned, sugar jar in hand, she was standing close enough that I almost forgot what I'd gone to retrieve. "Here," I said, setting it on the counter. "Thank you," she murmured, but instead of leaving, she pulled out one of the chairs and sat down. "Hope you don't mind." "Not at all," I said, taking the seat across from her. For a while, we just sat there, the silence filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of a television from another apartment. Her eyes wandered around the room, then back to me. And when they did, she smirked, softly, but unmistakably. You're impossible, you know that? I leaned back in my chair. Impossible how? Her smirk curved into something gentler. The way you look at me. The way you don't flinch, even when I try to push you away. She shook her head lightly, her hair falling forward before she tucked it back. Most people would have taken the hint by now. I met her gaze steadily. Maybe I don't want to. Her laughter was quiet, unguarded, and it filled the room with something I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. She leaned forward, resting her elbow on the table, her chin brushing against her hand as she studied me. You don't make things easy. I shrugged, trying to mask the thrum of my heart. Maybe I'm not supposed to. Her eyes softened then, the teasing still there but layered with something deeper. Slowly, as if testing the waters, she reached across the table and laid her hand lightly over mine. Her touch was warm, steady, her fingers curling just enough to anchor me in the moment. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The simple weight of her hand said more than words could, about the wall she'd been holding up, the quiet battle she'd been fighting with herself, and the choice she was making now, right here with me. When she finally did speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe normal isn't what I thought it had to be. I turned my hand, letting my fingers lace gently with hers. And for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't pull away. In that quiet, ordinary moment, her knee brushing against mine, her laughter still echoing faintly between us, I knew that whatever this was, however it unfolded, it was something neither of us wanted to deny anymore.